Well, great to see everybody here on this beautiful sunny day. Have your Bibles open in the New Testament. We're going to be in James chapter 4, and we'll be taking a look at the last few verses of James 4 and then going into James chapter 5. So put a bookmarker there. That's going to be our main text for the day. James chapter 4, beginning in verse 13 and going into chapter 5 when we get to that point in the lesson. Some things that you notice about James almost right away when you're reading this book is that it is a curiously Old Testament, New Testament book, isn't it? There's a lot of things about the book of James, just some of the literary features, the style in which it's written, some of the themes that you see and the language that's used. These are very Old Testament style things that you see in James. In fact, a lot of writers over the years have said that James is the most Old Testament of New Testament books. You may argue, I suppose, for some others, like the book of Hebrews perhaps, but that's just some people's opinions about that. But as you read James, though it is a short New Testament epistle, you will see wisdom in the book of James, just like you see in Proverbs or Ecclesiastes. You're going to see repeated mentions of the word law throughout the book. You're going to see the kind of parallelism that is observed in Hebrew poetry, where you see things compared and contrasted in these little couplets. In the book of James, there's differences between rich and poor that are observed. You see above versus below in a lot of passages. You also see differences between humility and arrogance, which is what we're going to take a look at here today. Most notable for our purposes in today's lesson is the use of critical or polemic language that is used. If you've ever read any of the minor prophets, you know that they're not particularly pleasant reads, are they? You go through the minor prophets, and you can include the major prophets as well, but as you look through the books of prophecy in the Old Testament, it's a lot of criticism, it's a lot of castigating, it's a lot of bringing people back from a place of arrogance to a place of humility. It's reminding the wealthy that they need to take care of the poor. It's reminding the unjust that their injustice will be remembered by God and judged in the end. And so that theme that you see from the prophets in the Old Testament of criticizing their contemporaries is also carried over into the book of James in the passage that we're going to be taking a look at today. This is a two-part lesson here. It's not two parts as in next Sunday, but two main points that we're going to take a look at. In each of these sections of Scripture in James 4:13 and then in James 5:1 begins with a similar phrase, come now. And so let's take a look at the first passage here in James 4, verses 13 through 16. Come now. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we shall go to such and such a city and spend a year there and engage in business and we'll make a profit. Yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You're just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and also do this or that. But as it is, you boast in your arrogance, and all such boasting is evil. Now, somebody might immediately walk away from this passage and say, so let me get this straight. Day planners are sinful. Is that what he's saying there in James 4, that day planners are sinful, that there's no planning at all, you're not allowed to plan about what's going to happen tomorrow, you can't make business plans, family plans, travel plans? Is James saying that when you go on vacation, you're going to say, I'm about to get on a plane, and I don't know where it's going, and I don't know what we're going to do when we get there, but if the Lord wills? Is that really what James 4 is talking about, is that you're not allowed to do any planning or preparing at all? Well, of course not. I don't think anybody would try to make that argument. But what we see out of wisdom literature, very similar to Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, is that hyperbole or exaggeration is used to prove a point about something. And so here it's being exaggerated, this very, very hyperbolized, like arrogance that you see, this confidence that this person has, this hypothetical person that I have all my plans laid out. I know what I'm going to do and where I'm going and what I'm going to do when I get there. And I am definitely going to be there for a year, and we are definitely going to make a profit. And he says that's boasting and arrogance is what it is. And so you've moved from the area of let's be prepared to I know exactly what's going to happen in the future, and I have not factored in the biggest variable of all, which is God. Now, just to kind of prove the point a little bit more that we're not saying that day planning is sinful, the Apostle Paul also made plans. He talks about his plans a lot in several of his letters. In Romans chapter 15, for example, he uses very specific language of some plans that he has moving forward. He says in Romans chapter 15, of these plans that he has to go to even Spain, whenever I go to Spain, for I hope to see you in passing and to be helped on my way there by you, when I have first enjoyed your company for a while, but now I am going to Jerusalem serving the saints. And he even mentions it again in verse 28, that I will go on my way of you to Spain when I have finished this. In Romans 15, Paul does not use the language of maybe or if. He says, I am coming to you, and when I'm done there, I'm going to go to Spain. He doesn't speak of it as if it's a hypothetical thing. He says, I'm planning to go to Spain. And this is not the only place, of course. In 1 Corinthians 16, he also makes mention of plans that he has. And nobody would ever take a look at 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and verse 2. On the first day of every week, let each of one of you put aside and save as he may prosper, that no collections be made when I come. Not if I come, but when I come. And when I arrive, in verse 3, when I arrive, whomever you may approve, I shall, not I might or I could, I shall send them with letters to carry your gift to Jerusalem. And so in this whole thing that he mentions in 1 Corinthians 16 of taking up a collection, there's this assumption that, yeah, we're making plans. Yeah, I'm planning on being there. You better prepare for me to be there. Take up a collection so that when I come, it's ready to go, and I can send it with these people, and it will go to Jerusalem. So clearly, even the Apostle Paul made plans. So when James talks about this in James chapter 4, what exactly is the prohibition there? If it's not literally all plans of all kinds, what's being prohibited? Well, that's where that motive comes in. He says, but as it is, you boast in your arrogance. And so it's the motive behind those things. It is less about the language itself and more about the attitude that we have behind our plan making. In our plans, is there arrogance? In our plans, is there this undue self-confidence? In our plans, is it mere self-reliance where I trust in myself, I make my own plans, I make my own luck, and nobody tells me what's going to happen to me today, tomorrow, or any other day in the rest of my life? When we fail to factor in the variable of God's will, our plans are destined to fail. Take Proverbs chapter 19, for example. Go to Proverbs 19. And a great passage in Proverbs 19 and verse 21. Many are the plans in a man's heart, but the counsel of the Lord, it will stand. Proverbs 27 and verse 1. Do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring forth. Isaiah chapter 30, very similarly. In Isaiah chapter 30, notice here, as he says in Isaiah 30, beginning in verse 1, woe to the rebellious children, declares the Lord, who execute a plan, but it's not mine, and make an alliance, but not with my spirit, in order to add sin to sin, who proceed down to Egypt without consulting me, to take refuge in the safety of Pharaoh, and to seek shelter in the shadow of Egypt. Therefore, the safety of Pharaoh will be your shame, and the shelter in the shadow of Egypt will be your humiliation. You made plans, but they didn't fit my plans. You had an idea, but it was not of my will. And instead of trying to understand the will of God, you rejected that will. You rebelled against that will, and you actually went the opposite direction that I was telling you to go. And so these great plans that you've made of going to Egypt, those are the very plans that will end up blowing up in your face. So when you don't factor God in, when you say, I'm going here and no one's going to stop me, I'm going to do this, and it is certain, it is 100%. This is how I want to live. But you don't factor God into any of those decisions, those are the kinds of the decisions that blow up in your face in the end. But by aligning our will with God's will, then all of our plans will be established. And numerous passages also attest to this, that when you line up your will with God's will, your plans are established. Now, it actually has to be by God's will. Because this is not some like magic trick, like, so what you're saying is, if I just add if the Lord wills to everything I say, then like my plans will come true. What you're saying is I can kind of like pull the wool over God's eyes and go, so God, I'm going to go preach the gospel in Mexico. And if I'm down in Mexico and happen to be at the beach while I'm there, I catch myself at the beach getting some sun, but I'm going to Mexico to preach. God's not fooled by any of that. God's not tricked by that. There's no one-upping God. There's no pulling the wool over God's eyes. When we align our will with God's will, what it means is that I want the same things God wants. I want people to be saved. I want my children to be saved. I want the church to grow. I want to have opportunities to teach. I want to grow spiritually. I want to be disciplined and helped grow into a better person. I want to have a spouse who will hold me accountable to things and correct me when I'm wrong. I want children that will keep me honest and won't let me get away with hypocrisy. When my will is aligned with God's will, maybe we're not talking about every specific thing comes to pass. You don't maybe get the job that you want or whatever it happens to be. We're not talking about God as a vending machine, God as a wishing well, God as a magic genie. We are talking about God is on a path. And when you join God on the same path, you will find the end of that path to be satisfying and incredibly fulfilling and eternally significant. That's how you bring your will to pass, when your will is the same as God's will. And this is splendidly shown, by the way, in the predetermined plan of the gospel. The gospel is talked about like predestination in several passages, like Ephesians 1, for example, in Romans chapter 8 as well. It's talked about as a predestination of a sort. Now, does that mean that God hand selects you to be saved and you to be saved, but it doesn't matter what you do or it doesn't matter what your behavior is? And we're not talking about Calvinism. We are talking about God's will. God's will is that Jesus would come, that Jesus would die, that he would be raised from the dead, so that everybody through Jesus who believes and is baptized shall be saved. That's a predetermined plan from eternity. And if you align your will with his will, you are saved by that predetermined plan. And I think that's a really splendid way that we see the way that our wills can come to alignment together. But let's put it into practice before we move on to another point. At the risk of contradicting myself, maybe there is something to be said about adding the phrase, if the Lord wills, right? I just got done saying, it's not really about what you say, but why you say it, but I'm going to backtrack and say, actually what you say does make a difference. And maybe if you're struggling with this problem in James 4, like if you are the sort of person who's self-reliant and self-confident and a boaster of arrogance, like if that is something that you're struggling with, maybe a great big heaping dose of if the Lord wills in your language might help with that. Because what we say is a reminder of things. Like maybe you don't want it to become just like empty repetition. Like, well, if the Lord wills, we're going to go to Dairy Queen this afternoon. If the Lord wills, I'm going to put my shoes on this morning. If the Lord wills, I'll brush my teeth tonight. Like, you don't want it to become just like this empty thing, but I think James' advice is pretty good. When you change your language, your will may kind of come into conformity with that eventually. When I'm making plans, do I pump the brakes a little bit and say, you know what? Let's be careful about this. We need to make sure we factor God in. What would God want? What's God's plan? What's God's will? If the Lord wills. If the Lord wills. And I think if we did include that in our language a little bit more, that might help a great deal in changing our perception on things. Even Jesus himself talked about the Lord wills in his prayers in Matthew chapter 6 in the model prayer, your will on earth as it is in heaven. He talked about God's will. In Luke chapter 22, in this amazing, powerful moment in Jesus' life, as he's praying to God in the garden, he says, it's not my will, but your will be done. So even Jesus himself instructed us both by command as well as by his own example to factor God's will and use it as a part of our language to remind us of that. Don't ignore the reminders, by the way, that are all around us. If you don't know that life is short, just watch the news. If you're reading James 4 and it says your life is but a vapor and here it is and then it's gone and you go, yeah, that's not me though. Don't be so sure. Turn on the news and you'll see how fragile life is. Give the news 5 minutes. They'll tell you something horrible about how life is going. I think also nature teaches us a thing or two. When you catch that candid moment in nature, you will see the fragility of life reflected in those little moments. And I don't obviously want to get gross or crude or anything like that, but you know, we forget that the way that all life is perpetuated is by the death of something else. That beautiful bird in your backyard is either a predator to something or it's about to be a prey to something else. My parents have a bird feeder in their backyard, and it attracts all manner of small seed-eating birds. But the falcons have also discovered the bird feeder. And they say at least once a week, a falcon swoops out of nowhere and takes a bird right off the bird feeder. And my dad always says, well, it is a bird feeder, isn't it? But in all seriousness, every dead animal on the side of the road should be a reminder to you. Every nature program that you watch where life and death are in the balance at almost every single moment of a creature's life, like, shouldn't that also be a parable that reminds you of what James is trying to tell us, that life is just a vapor? It is so short and it is so fragile. And so for you to be so boastful and so arrogant as to say, I know what the next year is going to be like, and I'm going to make big plans, and I'm definitely going to make a profit in such and such city. For you to speak with that level of arrogance, when every little animal that dies on the side of the road, every little creature that becomes prey to something else, every dear loved one that is sick and dying in all of our families, when all of those reminders are all around us all the time, for you to be so boastful, that's what James is talking about. He ends the chapter then by saying, to the one who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, to him it is sin. You know the right thing to do and you don't do it, then it's sin. Now before we move on to chapter 5, I want to address one quick thing, because somebody may read that last verse in James 4 and say, aha. So what he's saying is, to the one who doesn't know the right thing to do and doesn't do it, to him it is not sin. Isn't that what he's saying? Not really. Let's let James make the point that he's making. I try to be careful with the Bible to just let the Bible make its own point and not try to extract something out of it that's not there. The point James is making is, when you know the right thing to do, and in your arrogance and your stubbornness and your self-will, you refuse to do it, that's a sin. That's a sin. That's the point James is making. Is James' point, did James include this in his letter as like, and just if anyone's clever enough to catch it, I also included the little get out of jail free card of ignorance there, if you're clever enough to catch it. did James include that in his letter as like the great big get out of jail free card for sin? Like, as long as you plug your ears and say, no, I didn't hear you call it sin, so it's not a sin to me. Is that why he included that verse? Well, I don't think so. Let James make his point. His point is, if you know the right thing to do and you don't do it, that's a sin. That's his point. And I think there's other scriptures as well that you got to sort of factor in there to remember that just because you're ignorant that something is wrong doesn't suddenly make it right. Just because you're ignorant that something is sin doesn't suddenly make that okay in every way. Otherwise, the gospel is a pointless endeavor. For Paul himself talked in 1 Timothy chapter 1 about that God deemed Paul when he was still Saul of Tarsus, the furious, raging Pharisee, God deemed him to be a sinner. And Paul acknowledges that in 1 Timothy 1, verses 12 through the end of the chapter. I was a sinner. Now, the reason why God showed me mercy is because I acted ignorantly in unbelief. There's that ignorance. So if ignorance is the get out of jail free card and it means that something's not sinful, I just didn't know, therefore it's not sinful. If ignorance is the great big get out of jail free card, then why did Saul of Tarsus have to make any changes to his life? Because he acted ignorantly in unbelief, didn't he? And yet, even acting ignorantly in unbelief, Paul was deemed a sinner. In fact, Paul even mentions in that context the greatest sinner of all. And if the greatest sinner of all doesn't get out of jail free card just because he's ignorant of his sin, doesn't mean anybody else can get away with that either. 1 Corinthians 4 and verse 4 as well. I am aware of nothing against myself, and yet I am not by this acquitted. Just because I don't know that I've done something wrong doesn't mean I'm somehow acquitted. A couple of examples from the book of Genesis as well. In Genesis chapter 12, the Pharaoh of Egypt tried to take Abraham's wife Sarah as his own, and yet it was regarded as a sin. He had no idea. Abimelech in chapter 20 similarly gets after it. He says, Abraham, dude, why didn't you tell me? I had no idea that this was your wife, and you were going to let me just marry her and get away with this and bring curses upon all of our land? You ought to have told me. Well, yeah. Anyway, I don't want to belabor that point too much, but I do think it's interesting how this is sort of the hinge point between chapter 4 and chapter 5. Because he begins chapter 5 with the same language that he does back earlier. Come now. Where before it was, come now, you who say we shall do this business in such and such city. He now begins this section by saying, come now, you rich. Let's go ahead and read this together in James chapter 5. I want to read verses 1 through 6 with you. James 5, 1 through 6. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries which are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted and your garments have become moth-eaten. Your gold and your silver have rusted. Their rust will be a witness against you and will consume your flesh like fire. It is in the last days that you've stored up your treasure. Behold, the pay of the laborers who mowed your fields and which has been withheld by you cries out against you. And the outcry of those who did the harvesting has reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. You've lived luxuriously on the earth. You've led a life of wanton pleasure. You've fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and put to death the righteous man, and he does not resist you. It's pretty provocative language, isn't it? You can certainly see it in your mind's eye, the rusty treasure and the broken garments and things rotting away and corrupting. He definitely paints a powerful picture. And yet this picture also borrows heavily from other passages in the Bible, both Old and New Testament. Amos, I think, is, and I say this about everything, I always say something is my favorite. You know how I'm like that? Like whenever I'm reading a psalm, like, oh, that's my favorite psalm. Or whenever I'm reading a New Testament book, I think this is my favorite. Whichever apostle I'm talking about, I think that's my favorite apostle. I know I always say that. Amos might actually be my favorite minor prophet. Might be. But I love Amos because Amos is a farmer. He talks about plants and vegetables and the natural world. He sees things on ground level. He's not some famous person. He's not some rich person. He sees things on ground level where other regular Joes see them. James 5 borrows very heavily from the language of Amos. Amos in his book talks about corruption of the wealthy and the way the wealthy have seated themselves on ivory couches, luxuriating and leaning back and eating fattened calves and strumming on their harps and making tunes up while everybody else is starving. Amos talks about changing the weights and measures in the marketplace so that you can cheat people out of their hard-earned wages. As he says, I believe it's in chapter 8 where he says, let us make, I believe it's chapter 8 verse 5, let us make the bushel smaller and the shekel bigger. You think inflation is a modern day problem? That's inflation right there. Look at what he says. Let us make the bushel smaller, but the shekel bigger. You get less and less and less for your shekel. The bushel gets smaller, but the shekel gets bigger. That's the kind of language that's used in Amos. You rich people, you rotten-hearted, corrupt, rich people. And I imagine Amos wagged his finger at them too. Give you some examples here. Go to Amos chapter 4 and verses 1 through 3. Amos 4 beginning in verse 1. Hear this word, you cows of Bashan, who are on the mountains of Samaria, who oppress the poor, who crush the needy, who say to your husbands, bring now that we may drink. I was going to do a more outlandish voice there, but I decided to restrain myself a little bit. The Lord has sworn by his holiness, behold, the days are coming upon you when they will take you away with meat hooks, and the last of you with fish hooks. You'll go out through the breaches in the walls, each one straight before her, and you will be cast to Harmon. He says in chapter 5, verses 11 through 13, therefore, because you impose heavy rent on the poor and exact a tribe of grain from them, though you've built houses of well-hewn stone, yet you will not live in them. You have planted pleasant vineyards, yet you will not drink their wine because of your transgressions. That's James 5, isn't it? That's exactly what James is saying. In chapter 8, like we've already mentioned, in chapter 8, verses 4 through 6, hear this, you who trample the needy to do away with the humble of the land, saying, when will the new moon be over so that we may buy grain and make this and the Sabbath that we may open the wheat market, to make the bushel smaller and the shekel bigger, and to cheat with dishonest scales, so as to buy the helpless for money and the needy for a pair of sandals, and that we may sell the refuse of the wheat. And so James says, come now, you rich, just as Amos does. And it's time to turn your times of joy into times of weeping and howling. Because by your own behavior, you're storing up for yourselves treasures of wrath. Jesus also spoke about this. I think that's why James borrows from the imagery that Jesus uses too in James chapter 6. We know from James 6, Jesus talks about storing up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. James uses the same language there in chapter 5, verse 1, doesn't he? Your miseries that are coming upon you, and in verse 2, your riches have what? Rotted, and your garments have become moth-eaten. It's almost as if James was just right there listening to the Sermon on the Mount in person. That he had personal experience learning at the Master's feet. That we need to be reminded, just as Jesus did, just as Amos did, just as James does in our passage, we need to be reminded of the corrupting and consuming nature of earthly things. That when we live for the flesh, it is only the flesh that we shall receive. When we live for worldly things and worldly pleasures, those are the only things that we get in the end. When we live a corrupted life, it is to corruption that we go for eternity. You remember what was said to the rich man in the story of the rich man and Lazarus. You had your good things in life. Lazarus didn't. And now you're living a life that's a reflection of the lack of gratitude and charity that you showed in your life. You're paying the price for a luxurious and wanton life. I wonder what cries out against each one of us. This idea of the laborers who mowed your field, those who practiced the harvest or did the harvest, they cry out against you in verse 4. I'm asking rhetorically, of course, but what in your life cries out against you? The blood of Abel, O righteous Abel, cried out against Cain. God reminded Cain of that in Genesis chapter 4. The same language is used in Habakkuk 2, verses 9 through 11. What cries out against me? What cries out against you? What skeleton do you hide in your closet? What inkling of regret do you have about something in your life? Because God hears and sees all of it. Every injustice, every tear, every bit of pain that we inflict on somebody else, every selfish taking of what is not ours to have. Am I neglecting my relationships? Like to my parents, to honor my mother and my father? To my children, to raise them up in the fear and knowledge of the Lord? To my spouse, to love my spouse the way that Christ loves his church? Am I holding on to grudges from the past? What about the gossip that I spread? That I think I'm keeping nice and tidy and anonymous, and nobody will ever know what I've said about somebody else? What about the countless women and children who are caught up in porn and human trafficking that I am tacitly harming with my supposedly harmless online behavior? What cries out against you? God hears all of it. And though our lives may be quite luxurious, they betray us. They betray us in our arrogance. They betray us in our self-confidence and our assuredness that we can get away with what we want. Appearances can be very deceiving, and that's what verse 5 is all about. You've lived luxuriously. You've had a life of wanton pleasure. You've fattened your hearts for what? For a day of slaughter. James directly addresses this misconception that we sometimes have about life where if it looks good, it probably is good. That goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 3. And the fruit on the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For with her own eyes Eve looked upon the fruit. And that fruit certainly looked good to the eyes and looked enticing. Didn't appear to be anything wrong with it. And so our lives are fattened calf lives. Wanton pleasure and luxury. Prepared for what? Yeah, but God has blessed me, so surely God is okay with me. Yeah, but God has given me long life and health, and I've got lots of family and lots of money saved up in the bank, so clearly God must like me a great deal, or he would not have given me this incredible life. Eglon in the book of Judges also had a nice fat life. And we know what God thinks about Eglon, or at least, at the very least, we know what Ehud thought about Eglon. Looks can be very deceptive. God does really care about the details also. I think it's the last point I want to make here, and the lesson will be yours. I think it's really interesting here to look at this passage and see things like debts, employee and employer relationships. Like you might think, well, God doesn't care about stuff like that. God wouldn't care if I just sort of skimmed a little off the top. God doesn't really care how I treat my employees, as long as I come to church and do what I'm supposed to do and look the part. It's really interesting here in James 5 how God is very much concerned about the little things in your life, because the little things in your life are indicative of what your priorities are. Just as Jesus pointed out in Matthew 25, on the basis of what will we be judged according to Matthew chapter 25? Did you give a cup of cold water? Did you share food? Did you clothe that person? Help that person in need? And the people who say, I didn't. I never helped that person. I never clothed that person. I never gave anyone something to drink. Those are the people cast out to hell with the devil and his angels. Both the law and Jesus in his ministry taught about daily goodness and daily charity and daily neighborliness, because those things are all indicative of what's happening here. So where's your heart? Is your heart with God today, or is it far away on your stuff and your pleasures and your things and your plans that you're making and the places you're going to go and the things that you're going to do with your life? Because at the end of all of it, no matter how rich we are, or no matter what we've accomplished, or no matter where we've been and visited and traveled, we all, at the end of our lives, have an inescapable destiny, which is to face the judgment seat of God. So better make your life right today. Because just as he says in James 4 that we read a few minutes ago, your life is a vapor, it will not last. You have no idea how short this life is until you face to face with mortality right then and there. So whatever spiritual need you might have, please let it be known by coming forward as we stand and sing.